Hello again, everybody, and good afternoon. Alright, yep, got my Jazz hoodie on. They keep losing by like 1 or 2 points. It's frustrating. I'd rather somebody lose by 30 points almost. But when it's 1 or 2 points, there's so many little things. Little free throws they could have made. Anyway, but I digress. So, this afternoon, because we've been going over weather-related stuff quite a bit. And so, I figure let's do a little bit of something different. Something that will make us feel warm, something that's been entered into the van quite a bit more. Remember, it's okay as long as it has a lid on it. If it doesn't have a lid or if it's food, it is not okay in the van. So please no eating in the van, anybody. Now I'm finding wrappers. So I'm going to be watching. If I catch you, then no, just you can't have candy. I'm sorry, because we're not supposed to eat in the van. I don't want ants. They're horrible little creatures that are hard to get rid of. I mean, they're actually fantastic, but when you're trying to get rid of them, not so much. But I digress. The subject that I've chosen is the history of the U.S. coffee shop. So this will just be something to warm you up while it's cold outside and think about hot coffee or warm coffee or whatever kind of cappuccino, cafe latte, whatever it is that you like to drink. So, here we go. The history of the U.S. coffee shop. So not so much coffee and its history itself, but how in the U.S. coffee caught on. So coffee has been around in the United States for centuries, almost as long as the country has existed. But while the specialty coffee shops and independent cafes are becoming increasingly prominent in coffee hotspots across the U.S., how have things changed over the years throughout time? So I spoke with an industry expert to look at I didn't, but this person did, to look at where the U.S. cafe culture has come from and where it might be headed next. And then, so here is what it is. Okay, well, not so much about that. So it begins coffee and the American Revolution. So that's when we were fighting with England to gain independence for the United States. So a bunch of people were saying, no, we don't want to be under England's rule anymore. We're tired of it. So instead, we're going to fight on and make this its own independent country. So the first mention of coffee in the United States dates back to 1668. It was brought to New Amsterdam, now New York, either by the Dutch or by the British. To this day, debates persist over the first coffee house where the first U.S. coffee house was founded. But most argue it was either Boston or New York. Those two rivaling each other? Never. Robert Thurston is emeritus professor of history at Miami University and the author of Coffee, From Bean to Barista. He says that as far as he can tell, the correct answer is London Coffee House, which was established in Boston in 1669. So the introduction of coffee was 1668, with the first coffee house in 1669. During the American Revolution, drinking tea was seen as unpatriotic. It was a favored drink of the British. It really is, still is. Tea and crumpets. This meant that in no time at all, coffee became the drink of choice for true U.S. Americans. True. Which I'm sure my mom's like, fine, because she's from England, and she's like, have your coffee. It's disgusting. I don't. Yeah, she doesn't really drink coffee. At this time, most U.S. coffee houses were also located in New England, and many of them had a clear political affiliation. where the coffee house was situated or what it was named determined much of its patronage. And just the patronage, just whoever is going to the shops. For example, the British Coffee House in Boston was frequented by redcoats or British soldiers and other loyalists, while the Green Dragon, also in Boston, with the green, of course, for the Irish, was a meeting place for many dissenters against the British rule. Irish. Perhaps unsurprisingly, after the Revolution ended, the British Coffee House was taken over and aptly renamed the American Coffee House. All right, so we finish up with the American Revolution. Now we moved on. Now the entire country is deciding basically where they should go. And so, of course, then slavery starts bringing people over. Indentured servitude was still a thing to where that means you were indentured for a certain amount of time as an enslaved person. Sorry, they're not slaves, they're enslaved people. But you're indentured as an enslaved person for a certain amount of time and then typically let free. But then, of course, this leads to the American Civil War, where we say, hey, enslavement is not right, and so we need to do away with these Jim Crow laws and such. So after the Revolution, so this is during the American Civil War, a love of coffee took hold quickly in all new United States of America. It spread quickly over the decades that followed, and by the time the American Civil War broke out in 1861, about 200 years after it was first introduced, coffee was standard issue in both Union and Confederate rations. So everybody had their coffee on both sides of the Civil War. That said, it was more popular for the effects of caffeine rather than the flavor of the coffee itself. Kept you awake, kept you sharp, supposedly. The coffee was likely roasted over fire and extremely bitter. And soldiers would also add other ingredients like chicory or tree bark if they didn't have enough coffee for a full cup. So coffee was the drug of the Civil War, says Robert. It gave people energy and the ability to keep on fighting. It may have made a tremendous contribution to the Union's cause. Either way, works both ways. For example, at one stage, a Union naval blockade stretched coffee supplies in the South. This meant that Confederate soldiers were actually forced to trade their tobacco, which was plentiful, for coffee from their Union enemies across the border. All right, so that's how it happened during the American Civil War, or the U.S. Civil War. Coffee for the masses. So it wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th century that coffee shops became popular among regular people, as they started to become accessible for those who didn't work in the government or finance. This rise in popularity was driven somewhat by the fall in wholesale coffee prices towards the end of the 19th century. This coincided nicely with the expansion of the U.S. railroad network, which only helped coffee to proliferate. Just again, like with the Civil War, then you take coffee for something as big a construct as having a train that spans the entire country. And that's a lot of hard work. So you need something to keep people awake and keep them sharp. So soon, coffee was not just widespread, but also affordable, meaning that by the late 19th century, more or less anyone could find and drink it. So it used to be kind of a delicacy. Like, oh, you can afford coffee. Well, my. Professor Thurston says, as early as the 1870s, there were drawings of coffee breaks among coffee shop girls in New York City, and this spread as a tradition fairly quickly. The famous coffee break in the U.S. started from the 1920s onward. This provided a social setting, a point where people could meet. So now you have Now you have more of a water cooler situation because a lot of people don't like the smell of coffee or the taste of coffee, and water's healthier for you, technically. So, but it used to be coffee shop talk, so you'd have to suffer your way through some coffee if you didn't like it, even to make sure that you're still part of that general framework within your profession. However, at this time, coffee shops were still relatively uncommon. While cafe society did emerge in some capacity in the 1920s, this actually had more to do with prohibition than coffee, which makes sense, as this culture centered more around jazz, dancing, and bootlegged alcohol. And bootleg just means it was made by somebody out in the woods, and they sold it illegally because prohibition meant no selling of alcohol anywhere. It wasn't until another significant event in the 1920s that the U.S. modern obsession with coffee began. What could it be? Then it goes right into the Great Depression. It's a good history lesson overall. So, when the Great Depression hit in 1929, food banks or soup kitchens began handing out coffee and donuts to hungry citizens. Professor Thurston says that in major sites around the world, this kick-started the idea of an affordable cup of coffee. According to him, this is why many people across the U.S. still expect a cheap, accessible cup of coffee wherever they go. In New York City, for instance, it's still possible to get a US $1 cup of coffee in one of those iconic blue cups. Yeah, they're the like kind of tin cups. Coffee culture evolved again in 1941 after things kind of calmed down a little bit from the Depression, but then of course we start hitting World War II when the U.S. joined the Second World War. Sorry, I just skipped ahead. Once more, coffee was issued as part of every U.S. soldier's rations, which were supplied by the burgeoning Maxwell House, or burgeoning, sorry, not the bourgeois, the burgeoning. Too much sociology, sorry. However, it was the growth of advertising after the Second World War that really fueled coffee's popularity in the 20th century. So, of course, advertising starts coming in. Just as you learn through the history of pretty much anything, like when we went through the history of Santa Claus and everything, but this, when people start advertising for something, then it really pushes it forward. Throughout the latter half of the century, newspapers, magazines, and television all began the wonders of coffee to families in the U.S. advertising, with focus on the nuclear family, which is 2 kids and a baby and mom and dad, which, luckily we don't have that anymore, and we have all sorts of different families of different sizes and shapes and folks. Compromising, comprising, a hardworking father, a dutiful wife and mother, and rosy children. It's no surprise then that coffee adverts from the time are angled towards family life. This was a different approach to European coffee adverts of the same era or area, which instead have promoted the class and sophistication of cafes. Now we get into diner coffee. So across U.S. coffee culture, however, one establishment bucks the trend and has persisted in spite of a third wave of coffee. This is the diner, a third place, which is now irrevocably, I can't say it. Irrevocably, no, irrevocably, yeah, it is, intertwined with how people perceive coffee in the U.S. Sorry, I can't speak my words. As far back as the 1900s, diners emerged as places where people could get a cheap meal and a drink lukewarm filter or instant coffee. Perhaps because of the affordability, they have persisted to this day. Diner coffee remains a U.S. phenomenon, too, and is commonly associated with dark roasts and automatic filter machines. Okay, so now coffee becomes widespread. Coffee shops. So in the late 1970s, the second wave of coffee emerged across the U.S., and people started to spend a significant amount of time in coffee shops. This was when cafe culture really started to become a social concept across the country. While the second wave emerged in the 1970s, it really started to gather speed in the 1980s. This also gave way to the emergence of coffee chains, perhaps the best example of which is Starbucks. Of course, we like Peet's. Some people like Starbucks. I like Peet's. Professor Thurston explains Starbucks and Howard Schultz really changed what we thought about coffee and it introduced U.S. citizens to the coffee shop in a new way. He also says that the second wave naturally paved the way for the third as people started to ask, is there something better than Starbucks? Pete. I'm not really a big coffee drinker. Through the 21st century, there was a final shift, the third wave of coffee. This steadily took hold in major cities like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago at first, before rapidly spreading further afield through the 2010s. Since the founding of the U.S. coffee houses, among before the American Revolution, coffee shop culture in the country has evolved significantly. From more rations to the third wave, it's clear that coffee has become an inextricable aspect of U.S. culture for centuries. How it will change in the future remains to be seen. However, with the third wave of coffee proliferating and specialty coffee culture continuing to become commercialized, there are certainly questions that there will be answered for years to come. So, what could you do with coffee? Think about it. There's a whole vast empire of coffee out there. What could you do with it? The world will only know when you come up with your new coffee idea. All right, everybody. Not sure if I'm going to see you for the rest of this week. Still paperwork on Friday. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But stay safe. Drink some coffee, hot chocolate, some tea even. You know, the Brits in the U.S. are allies now, so it's okay to drink tea. But stay warm and stay safe and cozy. And, take care of each other. All right. Ciao, everybody.